thousands of years before modern debates about intimacy, morality, and the boundaries of desire. A small, wandering tribe in the ancient Near East was quietly building one of the most influential moral codes the world has ever known. A code so powerful that billions of people across every continent still feel its weight today. Whether you realize it or not, the way you think about marriage, fidelity, shame, and the human body has been shaped by decisions made around desert campfires over 3,000 years ago. Welcome. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something. Wherever you are right now, whether it is late at night with headphones on, or during a long drive, or just settling in after a long day, drop a comment and tell me where in the world you are listening from. And if this story grabs you, as I believe it will, consider subscribing. We go deep into histories like this one, and there is always more to uncover. Now, what I am about to share with you is not a simple list of ancient rules. It is a journey into a world where every intimate act carried cosmic significance, where a husband owed his wife pleasure by law, where a woman's monthly cycle could make her untouchable for nearly 2 weeks, where a suspected unfaithful wife was forced to drink a mysterious potion in front of priests, and where a man's refusal to give his dead brother children was punishable by death from the heavens themselves. What makes this topic so compelling is not just the rules themselves, but the stories behind them. Because the Hebrew Bible is not a dry legal manual. It is a collection of narratives, laws, poems, and prophecies produced over centuries by a people who were passionately, sometimes desperately, trying to figure out the right relationship between the human body and the divine will. They did not always agree with each other. They argued, debated, revised, and reinterpreted. And the record of those arguments is preserved in the text with a remarkable honesty that most ancient civilizations never achieved. We are going to explore the full spectrum of their thinking, the laws that regulated marriage and mandated a wife's right to satisfaction, the taboos that governed menstruation and ritual purity, the punishments that awaited adulterers, and the ritual that tested suspected unfaithful wives, the stories of prostitutes who became national heroes and kings who fell through sexual temptation, the debates about seed, contraception, and the value of every potential life, and the ways in which all of this, every last detail, was woven into a theological vision that still shapes the moral landscape of the modern world. These are the sexual taboos of the early Hebrews, not the Sunday school version, the real story, the uncomfortable, fascinating, deeply human story behind the laws that shaped Western civilization. Let us begin where all great stories begin, with the world that existed before the rules were written. To understand what the early Hebrews did, you first have to understand what everyone else around them was doing. And what everyone else was doing would make most modern people uncomfortable. Picture the ancient Near East around 2000 to 1500 BCE. Vast empires rise and fall across Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the coastal cities of Canaan. Trade routes crisscross deserts and mountain passes. Great ziggurats pierce the sky, and at the center of nearly every major culture's religious life is sex. Not hidden, shameful sex. Sacred sex. Ritualized sex. Sex performed in temples, before altars, in the names of gods and goddesses who embodied fertility and desire. The Sumerians built entire temple complexes dedicated to Onah, their goddess of love, war, and raw sexual power. hymns were composed celebrating her body in vivid, explicit detail. Songs about her longing, her desire, even the physical details of her union with the shepherd god Dumuzid. And it was not merely poetry. In the cities of Mesopotamia, the temples of Inanna, later called Ishtar by the Akkadians and Babylonians, housed classes of women who served the goddess through sexual rites. Whether we call them priestesses, sacred servants, or something else entirely, scholars have debated for over a century. But the ancient records themselves are striking. Sumerian tablets from as early as 2400 BCE describe what can only be understood as organized sexual service operating within temple walls, divided into ranks and categories. The kings themselves were said to participate. Each year, during the New Year festival known as the Akitu, the king of Babylon was expected to ritually unite with a high priestess, reenacting the divine marriage of Ishtar and Dumuzid. This was the Hieros Gamos, the sacred marriage. It was believed to ensure the fertility of crops, the health of livestock, and the prosperity of the entire kingdom. Whether these unions were always literal or sometimes symbolic remains debated among historians, but the message was clear. In ancient Mesopotamia, sex was not a private act. It was a civic duty. Move westward to Canaan, the land the Hebrews would eventually claim as their own, and you find a similar landscape. The Canaanites worshipped a pantheon of deities, but their religious life revolved heavily around the cycle of agricultural fertility. Baal, the storm god, was their chief deity in many regions. His consort, Anat or Astarte, embodied the raw power of desire and reproduction. According to mythological texts discovered at the ancient city of Ugarit on the Syrian coast, Baal was believed to die each summer and descend to the underworld, causing the rains to cease and the land to wither. When he was reunited with his consort, the rains returned and the earth blossomed again for the Canaanite farmer. This was not abstract theology. It was life or death. And if you believed that the sexual union of the gods literally caused the rain to fall, then reenacting that union on earth in the temple through ritual intercourse seemed not only logical, but essential. Archaeological sites throughout Canaan have yielded hundreds of small clay figurines of nude women, often with exaggerated features. Scholars have debated whether these served as fertility charms, aids for childbirth, or objects of veneration for a mother goddess. What is certain is that sexuality permeated the religious imagination of the region in ways that the early Hebrews found deeply threatening. Down in Egypt, the picture was somewhat different, but no less charged. Egyptian mythology placed great emphasis on creation through sexual acts. The god Atum was said to have brought the world into existence through an act of self-pleasure, and temple art across Egypt depicted gods and goddesses in intimate union. The cult of Hathor, goddess of love and beauty, celebrated sensuality openly, with music, dance, and ecstatic worship. The Egyptian attitude toward the human body was notably relaxed by Hebrew standards. Medical texts from the Ebers Papyrus discussed contraception openly, prescribing mixtures of crocodile dung, honey, and acacia tips as contraceptive suppositories. The Egyptians had no qualms about representing the nude human form in art, and their love poetry, preserved on papyri dating back to the New Kingdom period, rivals the Song of Solomon in its frank celebration of physical desire. Marriage between siblings was practiced among the Egyptian royal family, a custom that the Hebrew code would explicitly condemn. The Hittites, whose empire stretched across Anatolia and into northern Syria, had their own distinctive approach to sexual regulation. Hittite law codes, among the most detailed in the ancient world, prescribed penalties for a range of sexual offenses, but also displayed a surprising pragmatism. Certain forms of bestiality were condemned, but others, specifically involving horses or mules, were treated with relative leniency. The Hittites also practiced sacred sexual rituals connected to purification ceremonies, using libations and potions in ways that bear an intriguing resemblance to the Hebrew Sotah ritual. Into this world stepped the Hebrews, a small, semi-nomadic people with a radically different idea. Their God had no consort. Their God had no body. Their God did not participate in the seasonal cycles of nature through sexual union. And everything about their emerging moral code was designed to draw a sharp, unmistakable line between their way of life and the practices of the nations surrounding them. The opening chapters of Leviticus 18 could not be more explicit about this intention. The text begins with a direct command. Do not follow the practices of Egypt where you once lived. Do not follow the practices of Canaan, where I am bringing you. This was not merely spiritual advice. It was a declaration of cultural identity. The Hebrews would define themselves, in large part, by what they refused to do in the bedroom and in the temple. But there is a detail here that most people miss entirely. The Hebrews did not always succeed in maintaining this separation. In fact, the biblical record itself is a testament to how frequently they failed. The book of Judges records a cycle of apostasy that repeats itself with almost mechanical regularity. The Israelites settle in Canaan. They begin worshiping local gods. They adopt local practices. Divine punishment follows. A leader rises to bring them back. They repent. And then the cycle begins again. The prophet Hosea, writing in the 8th century BCE, describes the situation with visceral imagery. He accuses the Israelites of playing the harlot with Baal, of going to the high places where sacred rites were performed, of burning incense under oaks and poplars and terebinths because the shade was pleasant. The language is deliberately sexual. Israel is portrayed as an unfaithful wife who has abandoned her true husband, the God of Sinai, for the seductive promises of the fertility cults. Archaeological evidence supports this picture. Excavations throughout Israel have uncovered hundreds of clay figurines representing female fertility deities, many found in domestic contexts, suggesting that ordinary Israelite households maintained connections to the old Canaanite practices long after the official religion condemned them. At Kuntilat Ajrud, a site in the northern Sinai, inscriptions dating to the 8th century BCE refer to Yahweh and his Asherah, suggesting that some Israelites believed their God had a female consort, exactly the kind of divine pairing that the Torah explicitly rejected. So the picture that emerges is not one of a pristine, morally unified people marching in lockstep against the corruptions of the surrounding world. It is a picture of a culture in constant tension, a culture whose leaders articulated a revolutionary vision of sexual morality, while the people themselves frequently reverted to the practices of their neighbors. The laws of the Torah were not merely descriptions of how things were. They were prescriptions for how things ought to be, written in full awareness that the reality on the ground was far messier, and that tension between ideal and reality, between law and practice, between aspiration and human weakness, is what makes this story so enduringly fascinating. But the story of how they drew those lines and what happened when they crossed them is far more complex and far more human than any simple list of prohibitions can convey. And that is exactly where we are heading next. Here is something most people do not expect to hear about the ancient Hebrews. In a world where women were routinely treated as property, where a wife had no voice and no recourse, Hebrew law enshrined something remarkable. A wife had a legal right to sexual satisfaction from her husband. Not a suggestion, not a cultural norm, a binding obligation. The concept is called Onah, and it appears in the book of Exodus, chapter 21, verse 10. The passage deals with a man who takes a second wife. The Torah commands that he must not diminish his first wife's food, clothing, or onah. While scholars have debated the exact meaning of this word for centuries, with some arguing it refers to shelter or anointing oil, the dominant rabbinic tradition has consistently interpreted onah as conjugal rights, the wife's right to intimacy. Think about what this means for a moment. In a world where Mesopotamian and Egyptian law focused almost entirely on a husband's sexual access to his wife, Hebrew law flipped the equation. The wife was not merely available, she was owed. And the husband who failed to fulfill this obligation was not simply a poor partner, he was a lawbreaker. The Mishnah, compiled around 200 CE, but reflecting traditions stretching back centuries, goes even further. It prescribes specific frequencies based on the husband's profession. A man of independent means was expected to be intimate with his wife every day, a laborer twice a week, a donkey driver once a week, a camel driver once every 30 days, and a sailor once every 6 months. The reasoning was practical. A man whose work kept him close to home had fewer excuses. A man who traveled had more. But here is the truly progressive element. This obligation applied even if the wife could not become pregnant, even if she was elderly, infertile, or already nursing. The purpose of intimacy was not solely reproduction, it was connection, comfort, the sustaining of the bond between two people. Rabbi Yaakov Emden, writing centuries later, captured the spirit of this law beautifully. He taught that a man should ease his wife's mind, make her happy, nurture her with words so that she feels passionate toward him. Now, none of this means early Hebrew marriage was an egalitarian paradise. It was not. Marriage was, in many practical ways, an economic transaction. The groom or his family paid a bride price, the mohar to the bride's father. The bride herself did not choose her husband in most cases. Marriages were arranged, and the father held significant authority over his daughter's future. But within the marriage itself, the wife was not without protections. The ketubah, the marriage contract, spelled out the husband's obligations in detail. If he failed to provide food, clothing, or onah, the wife was entitled to a divorce. This was not a theoretical right. It was enforceable. Courts could intervene. The husband could face financial penalties. In an era when divorce was almost entirely controlled by men, the right to demand dissolution of a marriage for the denial of intimacy was a rare and meaningful protection. Polygamy was another layer of this complex picture. The Hebrew Bible nowhere prohibits a man from taking multiple wives. Abraham had Sarah and Hagar. Jacob married both Leah and Rachel, plus their handmaids Bilhah and Zilpah. King David had at least 8 wives. Solomon, according to the biblical text, had 700. The law permitted it, and the culture practiced it, though scholars believe that economic realities meant most ordinary Hebrews were effectively monogamous simply because they could not afford multiple households. The practical complications of polygamy generated an entire body of legal discussion. If a man had 2 wives, one beloved and one less favored, how were conjugal duties to be divided? The Torah addresses this indirectly in Deuteronomy 21, requiring that the firstborn son's inheritance rights be respected regardless of which wife was his mother. The emotional reality of polygamous households is captured vividly in the patriarchal narratives. The rivalry between Sarah and Hagar produced jealousy, cruelty, and ultimately exile. The competition between Leah and Rachel for Jacob's affection is described in agonizing detail, with Leah naming her children as expressions of her longing to be loved, and Rachel trading away a night with their shared husband in exchange for fertility-enhancing mandrakes. These stories are not presented as ideals. They are cautionary tales, preserved in the sacred text as warnings about the emotional complexity that multiple marriages invariably produced. Then there were concubines, women who occupied a status somewhere between wife and servant. A concubine, or pilegesh in Hebrew, had fewer legal protections than a full wife. She did not receive a ketubah. Her children might inherit, but their status was uncertain. Yet she was not enslaved, and her presence in a household was socially accepted. The patriarchs themselves had concubines, and the institution persisted well into the period of the kings. And then there was the strangest marriage obligation of all, levirate marriage, the yibum. If a man died without children, his surviving brother was obligated to marry the widow and produce offspring in the dead man's name. The firstborn son of this union would be considered the heir of the deceased brother, carrying on his name and inheriting his share of the family property. This was not optional. It was a sacred duty. Deuteronomy chapter 25 describes the ceremony of refusal, called chalitza, in which a brother who refused to perform the levirate duty was publicly humiliated. The widow would remove his sandal before the elders and spit in his direction, and his family would be known as the house of the unsandaled one. The shame was intended to be lasting. The logic behind this practice was deeply rooted in the Hebrew understanding of identity and continuity. A man's name, his line, his connection to the covenant with God all depended on descendants. To die without children was a kind of spiritual death. The levirate marriage was designed to prevent that catastrophe, to ensure that no branch of Israel was ever truly cut off. The Book of Ruth provides the most beloved illustration of this principle at work. Ruth, a Moabite widow, follows her Israelite mother-in-law Naomi back to Bethlehem after the deaths of both their husbands. With no one to fulfill the levirate obligation directly, Naomi devises a plan. She sends Ruth to the threshing floor where Boaz, a wealthy relative, is sleeping. Ruth uncovers his feet, a phrase many scholars believe is a euphemism for a more intimate act. Onan lies beside him. When Boaz wakes, startled, Ruth asks him to spread his garment over her, a symbolic request for marriage and protection. What follows is a legal negotiation worthy of a courtroom drama. Boaz wants to marry Ruth, but there is a closer relative with a prior claim. At the city gate, before witnesses, the closer relative renounces his right, removing his sandal and handing it to Boaz as a sign of the transfer. Boaz marries Ruth. She bears a son named Obed, who becomes the grandfather of King David. The story is tender, strategic, and deeply revealing. A foreign woman uses the Hebrew system of sexual obligation to secure her own future and the continuation of her dead husband's line. The community celebrates rather than condemns her boldness. And the child born from this union becomes an ancestor of the greatest king in Israelite history. There is one more dimension of Hebrew marriage that deserves attention before we move on: the betrothal period. In Hebrew law, betrothal, called erusin, was not merely an engagement in the modern sense. It was a legally binding stage of marriage. Once a couple was betrothed, they were considered husband and wife in the eyes of the law, even though they had not yet begun living together or consummated the relationship. Dissolving a betrothal required a formal divorce document, a get, and if a betrothed woman was found to have been unfaithful, the punishment was stoning, harsher even than the penalty for an unfaithful married woman. This creates a peculiar situation in Hebrew law. A woman could be legally married, subject to adultery laws, and yet have never shared a bed with her husband. The sanctity of the bond was established not by physical union, but by legal covenant. Sex was important, but the commitment came first. But as we are about to discover, the obligations of marriage were only the beginning. The Hebrews had far more to say about what happened outside the marriage bed, and some of those rules were enforced with a severity that still shocks us today. If you have ever wondered how obsessed the ancient world was with female virginity, the Hebrew Bible will remove any doubt. Because in the world of the early Hebrews, a bride's virginity was not merely a personal matter, it was a community event. Deuteronomy chapter 22 lays it out in language that most modern readers find deeply uncomfortable. If a man marries a woman and then claims that she was not a virgin on their wedding night, the case goes before the elders of the town. The bride's parents are expected to produce evidence of her virginity. The text calls this the signs of virginity, traditionally understood as the blood-stained cloth from the wedding night, proof that the marriage had been consummated with a virgin. If the parents produced the cloth and the husband's accusation was false, he was punished. He would be flogged, fined 100 shekels of silver, which was double the standard bride price, and forbidden from ever divorcing the woman. His lie would cost him permanently. But if the evidence could not be produced, if the bride was found not to be a virgin, the consequences were devastating. The text prescribes that she be brought to the door of her father's house and stoned to death by the men of her city. The reason given is chilling in its directness. She has done a disgraceful thing in Israel by being promiscuous while still in her father's house. Now, before we let the horror of this settle too deeply, it is worth asking some important questions that scholars have been wrestling with for centuries. How often was this actually carried out? What constituted valid evidence? And was the blood test even medically reliable? The answer to the first question is probably very rarely. The Talmud, which records extensive rabbinic discussion of these laws, makes clear that the legal standards for carrying out capital punishment were extraordinarily high. 2 eyewitnesses were required. The accused had to have been warned beforehand. The entire proceeding was reviewed by a court of 23 judges. Many rabbis openly stated that a court that executed one person in 7 years, or even 70 years, was considered bloody and excessive. As for the blood test itself, medical knowledge tells us what the ancient Hebrews did not know. Not all women bleed during their first intercourse. Factors including physical activity, anatomy, and age can all affect whether the hymen produces visible blood. The rabbis, to their credit, seem to have recognized the unreliability of this test over time. Talmudic discussion includes extensive debate about what constituted valid proof and under what circumstances a woman might legitimately lack the expected signs. But the double standard is impossible to ignore. There was no comparable test for male virginity, no cloth, no public examination, no consequences. A man was expected to be sexually experienced, or at least his sexual history before marriage carried no legal weight. The burden of purity fell almost entirely on women. Why? The answer lies in the Hebrew understanding of lineage and inheritance. In a patrilineal society, where identity, property, and covenantal membership passed from father to son, the certainty of paternity was paramount. A bride who was not a virgin introduced doubt. Whose child was she carrying? Whose line would inherit the father's land? In a culture where land was not merely wealth but a theological promise, a gift from God to Abraham's descendants, this was not a trivial concern. It does not make the law just by modern standards, but it does help explain why a small, land-obsessed, covenant-bound tribe placed such extraordinary weight on the sexual history of its women. There is a lesser-known aspect of the virginity laws that reveals a surprisingly practical dimension. The Talmud records debates among the rabbis about what constituted a valid claim against a bride's virginity, and how the evidence should be evaluated. Some authorities argued that the cloth test was not the sole basis for judgment, and that other factors, including the bride's age, her physical health, and even the conditions of the wedding night, should be taken into account. A bride who had engaged in heavy physical labor, for instance, might not produce the expected signs, and this was recognized as a legitimate explanation. The rabbis also debated the time frame within which a husband could raise a complaint. Some argued he had only the wedding night itself. Others extended the window to several days. The discussion reveals a legal system grappling with the same tension that all legal systems face: the need for clear, enforceable rules versus the recognition that individual circumstances rarely fit neatly into categories. There is a further complication that scholars have noted. The bride price system created a financial incentive for false accusations. If a husband wanted to escape a marriage he found unsatisfactory, accusing his wife of not being a virgin was one way to do it. The penalty for false accusation, 100 shekels, and the loss of the right to divorce, was designed to counteract this temptation. In effect, the law created a symmetrical risk. The bride risked death if the accusation was true. The husband risked financial ruin if it was false. Both parties had powerful reasons to be honest. This system of mutual accountability, imperfect as it was, represents a more nuanced approach than the simple narrative of patriarchal oppression might suggest. The ancient Hebrew legislators were not naive about the potential for abuse within their own system. They built in safeguards, however inadequate they might seem to us, to prevent the most obvious forms of exploitation. And yet, this obsession with purity went far deeper than wedding nights. It extended to the most intimate biological rhythms of a woman's body. And that is where the story takes a turn that still affects millions of lives today. If you want to find the single most influential document in the history of Western sexual morality, you do not need to look very far. It is Leviticus chapter 18. 26 verses that changed the course of human civilization. This chapter sits at the heart of what scholars call the Holiness Code, a section of the Torah stretching from Leviticus 17 through 26 that lays out the rules for what it means to be holy, to be set apart, to be different from the surrounding nations. And nowhere is that difference more starkly defined than in the regulation of sexual behavior. The chapter opens with a declaration that echoes throughout the entire text. I am the Lord your God. You shall not follow the practices of Egypt. You shall not follow the customs of Canaan. You shall keep my statutes. The implication is clear. What follows is not merely a list of personal preferences. It is the boundary between Israel and everyone else, between holiness and defilement, between belonging to God's people and being cast out. And then the prohibitions begin, one after another, in a cascade of specificity that reveals just how carefully the ancient lawmakers thought about the tangled web of human desire. The first and longest section addresses incest. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your mother, your father's wife, your sister, your granddaughter, your aunt, your daughter-in-law, your brother's wife, a woman and her daughter, a woman and her sister while the first is still living. The list is remarkably thorough, far more detailed than anything found in the legal codes of surrounding cultures. Mesopotamian and Egyptian law addressed incest, but never with this level of granularity. Scholars have noticed something curious about this list. It never explicitly mentions a man's own daughter. The Talmud explains this by arguing that the prohibition was so obvious it did not need to be stated, especially since sex with a granddaughter was already forbidden. Some modern scholars, however, suggest that the omission may be the result of a scribal error in the text's transmission over centuries. After the incest prohibitions, the text turns to other forbidden acts. You shall not approach a woman during her menstrual impurity. We will return to this in detail shortly. You shall not have intimate relations with your neighbor's wife. You shall not give your children to be passed through the fire to Molech, a reference to child sacrifice that may also carry sexual connotations related to cult practices. Then comes verse 22, the verse that has launched 1,000 debates, fueled political movements, and divided communities for generations. Do not lie with a male as one lies with a woman. It is an abomination. The Hebrew word used here, toivah, is the subject of intense scholarly discussion. It is often translated as abomination, but that English word carries moral weight that the Hebrew may not fully support. Many scholars argue that toivah is primarily a term of ritual boundary, more accurately translated as taboo, or that which is forbidden. It is used throughout the Torah to describe things that are ritually impure or culturally unacceptable, not necessarily things that are inherently evil in a universal moral sense. The Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, the Septuagint, renders tova as badaligma, which refers specifically to ritual impurity rather than moral depravity. Had the author intended to describe a moral violation, some scholars argue the more likely Hebrew word would have been zimah, which carries stronger ethical connotations. Others point out that the context of Leviticus 18 is explicitly about distinguishing Hebrew practice from the rites of surrounding nations, particularly the sexual rituals performed in Canaanite temples. The prohibition may have been directed specifically at cultic practices, at the ritual sexual acts performed before the altars of Baal and Ishtar, rather than at all same-sex intimacy in every context. This interpretation remains deeply controversial. Traditional Jewish and Christian scholarship has generally understood the verse as a comprehensive prohibition. Modern, revisionist scholars have argued for a more limited reading. Neither side shows signs of yielding, and the debate continues to shape religious, legal, and cultural conversations around the world. What is often overlooked in these debates is the broader literary context of the verse. It appears in a chapter that is fundamentally concerned with boundaries, with drawing lines between Israel and its neighbors, between the holy and the profane, between what is permitted and what is forbidden. The ancient Hebrews lived in a world saturated with sexual imagery and practice, a world where the boundaries between human and divine sexuality were fluid and often deliberately blurred. The prohibitions of Leviticus 18 should be read, at least in part, as an attempt to establish clarity in a landscape of moral ambiguity. This is not to dismiss the weight of the prohibitions or to suggest they were merely cultural reactions. The theological framework in which they are embedded gives them a gravity that transcends cultural specificity. The repeated invocation of the divine name, "I am the Lord," hammered home after nearly every prohibition, makes clear that these were understood not as human conventions, but as divine commands. To violate them was to violate the covenant itself. The rabbinical tradition developed an elaborate system for categorizing the severity of different sexual offenses. At the top of the hierarchy were the 3 sins for which a Jew was expected to give up their life rather than commit them: idolatry, bloodshed, and sexual immorality. The inclusion of sexual sin alongside murder and idolatry gives us a measure of how seriously the tradition took these prohibitions. They were not secondary concerns. They were at the very heart of what it meant to live as a member of the covenant community. After verse 22, the text prohibits bestiality for both men and women, labeling it a perversion. And then the chapter closes with a warning that carries the weight of exile itself. Do not defile yourselves by any of these things, for by all of these the nations I am casting out before Yazoo have defiled themselves. The land became defiled, and I punished it for its iniquity, and the land vomited out its inhabitants. The metaphor is visceral. The land itself rejects those who practice these acts. The very soil of Canaan will expel the Israelites, just as it expelled the Canaanites, if they follow the same path. This is not a warning about personal morality alone. It is a threat of national annihilation. Leviticus 20 repeats many of the same prohibitions, but adds something Leviticus 18 does not: penalties, death for adultery, death for certain forms of incest, death for same-sex male intercourse, death for bestiality, exile for sex during menstruation. The escalation is startling, and it underscores how seriously the early Hebrews treated sexual boundaries. There is a scholarly debate worth mentioning here that illuminates the complexity of these texts. Many researchers have noted that Leviticus 18 and 20 represent 2 distinct literary layers, possibly composed at different times and later combined. Chapter 18 reads like a comprehensive list, perhaps used for recitation on solemn occasions. The Talmud records that it was read aloud on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, as a reminder of the ethical behavior expected of every Israelite. Chapter 20, with its emphasis on punishment, reads more like a legal code intended for judges. The relationship between these 2 chapters raises fascinating questions. Were the penalties in chapter 20 actually enforced? Or were they aspirational, designed to convey the seriousness of the offenses rather than to be literally applied? As we have already noted, the rabbinic legal system made capital punishment extraordinarily difficult to carry out. Some scholars have argued that the death penalties in Leviticus 20 were never intended as practical law, but as a theological statement about the gravity of sexual transgression. Others have pointed to the parallel between Hebrew law and the legal codes of surrounding cultures. The laws of Hammurabi, the Middle Assyrian laws, and the Hittite law codes all prescribed severe punishments for sexual offenses, including death for adultery in some circumstances. The Hebrew code was not unique in its severity. What made it distinctive was the theological framework in which it was embedded. These were not merely crimes against the social order. They were offenses against the holiness of God and the sacred covenant between God and Israel. There is one more element of the forbidden list that deserves attention before we move on. The prohibition in Leviticus 18, verse 21, against passing children through the fire to Moloch. This is usually read as a reference to child sacrifice. And indeed, the practice of dedicating or sacrificing children to the Canaanite deity Moloch is well attested in the archaeological and literary record. But some scholars have noted that the placement of this prohibition in the middle of a list of sexual offenses is strange. What does child sacrifice have to do with sexual morality? One intriguing interpretation suggests that the Molech ritual may have had a sexual dimension, perhaps involving the dedication of a man's offspring, his seed, to a foreign deity. The Hebrew word used here, zerah, can mean both seed and offspring, and in Leviticus 15 it explicitly refers to semen. If this reading is correct, the prohibition against giving one's seed to Moloch may be a condemnation not only of child sacrifice, but of a form of sexual cult practice that involved dedicating one's reproductive capacity to a foreign god. This interpretation remains speculative, but it highlights how deeply the Hebrew legislators connected sexual behavior to theological identity. Every act of intimacy was an act of faith. Every misuse of the body was a form of apostasy. The bedroom was not separate from the temple. They were intimately connected. But there was one prohibition in particular that touched the lives of Hebrew women more intimately and more frequently than any other. A prohibition that governed not what they chose to do, but what their bodies did naturally, without their consent. Every month, for roughly half her adult life, an ancient Hebrew woman entered a state that the Torah called Niddah. The word means separated or distanced, and it described the ritual condition of a woman during and after her menstrual period. The laws are found primarily in Leviticus chapter 15. A woman experiencing her menstrual flow was considered ritually impure for 7 days from the onset of bleeding. During that time, anyone who touched her became impure until evening. Anything she sat on or lay on became impure. Any man who had intimate relations with her during this period would himself become impure for 7 days, and everything he touched, including his bed, would carry that impurity. Let that settle for a moment. In practical terms, this meant that a menstruating woman in ancient Hebrew society was physically set apart from nearly all normal contact. She could not touch her husband. She could not share a bed with him. In the strictest interpretations, she could not hand him objects directly. She was, in the language of the law, a source of contagion, not of disease, but of ritual impurity. After her bleeding ceased, the woman was required to count 7 clean days, during which she monitored herself for any further discharge. Only after those 7 days could she undergo purification and resume normal life, including intimacy with her husband. The original biblical text is notably silent on one detail that later became central to Jewish practice. It says nothing about immersion in water. The requirement to bathe in a mikveh, a ritual bath, after the Niddah period is a rabbinic development, likely emerging during the Second Temple period and influenced, some scholars suggest, by the Roman bathing culture that permeated the Mediterranean world. By the time of the Mishnah, the laws had become even more stringent. Rabbinic tradition added the requirement that all women observe 7 clean days after their period, regardless of the length of their menstrual flow. This was based on a conflation of the regular menstrual impurity with the more severe condition of the Zava, a woman with an abnormal discharge. The practical result was a total separation period of approximately 12 days per month, sometimes more. Now, here is where the interpretation becomes truly fascinating and deeply divided. Was this system oppressive, or was it in some unexpected way empowering? The traditional view, championed by many Orthodox Jewish thinkers, frames Niddah as a gift. The monthly separation creates a cycle of longing and reunion within the marriage. The husband cannot take his wife for granted. Each month, there's a period of anticipation, followed by the joy of return. The night the wife comes home from the mikveh is celebrated as a kind of second wedding night, a renewal of desire and connection. Rabbi Manis Friedman, writing in the Shabbat tradition, has described the cycle of separation and reunion as the key to maintaining romantic attraction over a lifetime. Others have argued that the forced break from physical contact gives the wife a form of bodily autonomy that was rare in the ancient world. For those 12 or more days, her body was hers alone. No husband could claim it. But the feminist critique is equally powerful. In practice, the laws of Niddah applied only to women. Men experienced their own forms of impurity. A seminal emission rendered a man impure until evening, but the consequences were far less disruptive. A man who had a nocturnal emission washed and waited. A woman who menstruated reorganized her entire domestic life for nearly 2 weeks. The language of the Bible itself is troubling to many modern readers. The prophet Ezekiel uses Niddah as a metaphor for moral corruption. The Book of Lamentations associates it with filth and degradation, while the rabbis insisted that the Niddah state was morally neutral, a natural biological reality, with ritual but not ethical significance. The cultural associations were harder to shake. What is perhaps most remarkable about the Niddah laws is their endurance. 3,000 years after they were first codified, millions of Jewish women around the world still observe them. Mikvaot, ritual baths, are built in virtually every significant Jewish community on Earth. Archaeologists discovered not 1, but 2 ritual baths on the mountain fortress of Masada, built by Jews who were literally fighting for their lives against the Roman Empire. Even under siege, even facing annihilation, the laws of family purity were considered essential. Whether you see this as devotion or constraint, wisdom or patriarchy, depends largely on where you stand. But one thing is certain. No other set of ancient sexual regulations has maintained such unbroken continuity across 3 millennia. There is one more dimension to the Niddah laws that reveals how deeply they shaped the emotional texture of Hebrew life. The concept of harchakot, the distancing behaviors that were observed during the Niddah period. In strict observance, husband and wife did not merely avoid intercourse, they avoided all physical contact. They slept in separate beds. They did not pass objects directly to one another, placing things on a table or surface instead. They did not sit together on a swing or in any seating arrangement where the movement of one might be felt by the other. Even flirtatious conversation was discouraged. Imagine the discipline this required in a small, one-room dwelling, which was the reality for most ancient Israelite families. Husband and wife living in close quarters, surrounded by children, unable to touch for nearly 2 weeks out of every month. The psychological effect of this enforced separation cannot be overstated. It created a rhythm in the marriage that was both challenging and, according to its defenders, profoundly enriching. The night after immersion in the Makveh was called Leil Tevila, the night of immersion, and it was treated with the excitement and anticipation of a wedding night. Couples were encouraged to be together that night above all others. The Talmud even notes that Torah scholars who were away from home studying should return to their wives on Friday nights, because the Sabbath was considered a particularly auspicious time for marital intimacy. This cyclical pattern of separation and reunion, desire and fulfillment, has led some modern psychologists and relationship counselors to take a second look at the Niddah system. In a contemporary culture where availability is assumed and desire often fades into routine, the ancient Hebrew practice of mandated distance, followed by joyful return, offers an intriguing countermodel. Not everyone finds it compelling, but the fact that it continues to generate genuine interest 3,000 years after its inception speaks to something deep in the human experience of desire and longing. And yet, the Torah's regulation of the body did not stop with menstruation. There was one act, performed by one man in one specific story, that would echo through religious history for thousands of years and shape the debate over contraception that persists to this day. The story is brief, just a few verses in Genesis chapter 38. But its impact on Western morality is almost impossible to overstate. Judah, one of the 12 sons of Jacob, had 3 sons, Onan, and Shelah. Married a woman named Tamar, but the text tells us simply that was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord took his life. No further explanation is given. Dies, and Tamar is left a childless widow. Following the custom that would later be codified as levirate marriage, Judah instructs his second son, Onan, to take Tamar as his wife and produce offspring in his dead brother's name. The firstborn child of this union would legally be considered heir's heir, carrying on the dead man's lineage and inheriting his share of the family wealth. Onan agrees to the arrangement, partially. He takes Tamar, he sleeps with her. But every time they are together, he deliberately withdraws and spills his seed on the ground, preventing conception. He wants the sexual access. He does not want the obligation. The text is blunt about what happens next. What he did was evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord took his life also. 2 brothers, both dead by divine intervention, and the second one killed specifically for his sexual behavior. This passage has been interpreted and reinterpreted for thousands of years. In Jewish tradition, the Talmudic tractate Niddah, chapter 13, cites Onan's story as the basis for condemning both the withdrawal method and self-pleasure. The sages described the wasting of seed as an act worthy of severe punishment, an affront to the Creator, because it represented the destruction of potential life. The Christian tradition seized on this passage with even greater intensity. Church fathers and medieval theologians read Onan's sin as a divine condemnation of any sexual act that deliberately prevented conception. The word onanism entered European languages as a clinical term for both self-pleasure and withdrawal, and the story became the theological cornerstone for the Catholic Church's opposition to artificial contraception, a position maintained to this day. But modern scholars have pushed back against both interpretations. Many argue that Onan's true crime was not the physical act of spilling seed, but the betrayal of his obligation to his dead brother and to Tamar. He was using her body for his own satisfaction while deliberately denying her the child that was her right under the Levirate system. It was exploitation, not contraception, that provoked divine wrath. Others have pointed out the strange selectivity of the punishment. The Bible records countless sexual transgressions by its heroes. Abraham offers his wife to foreign kings. Judah himself, just a few verses later, sleeps with a woman he believes to be a roadside prostitute. Samson consorts with Philistine women. David commits adultery with Bathsheba and arranges the killing of her husband. In almost none of these cases does God intervene with immediate death. So why Onan? Some theologians have proposed a provocative answer. Onan was not merely being selfish, he was interfering with the messianic lineage. The tribe of Judah, the very tribe from which the promised Messiah would descend, was at stake. The stakes were not merely personal or familial. They were cosmic. Whatever the true reason, the legacy of this brief story is undeniable. A few verses about one man's refusal to fulfill his duty became the foundation for centuries of religious teaching about sex, reproduction, and the moral weight of every intimate act. The rabbinic tradition took the lesson of Onan and extended it in directions that the original text might not have anticipated. The Talmud developed an entire discourse around the concept of hashchatat zerah, the destruction of seed, treating it as one of the gravest sexual offenses. This prohibition affected not only the practice of withdrawal, but also self-pleasure and any form of intimate contact that resulted in the emission of seed outside a woman's body. The severity of the rabbinical attitude toward this issue is remarkable. The Talmud, in Tractate Niddah 13b, contains statements comparing the deliberate destruction of seed to bloodshed, arguing that the man who does so is as though he has taken a life. Other passages suggest that such behavior delays the coming of the Messiah, since every potential life is a potential vehicle for redemption. This teaching had profound practical implications. Jewish law developed extensive guidelines for marital intimacy, specifying permitted and prohibited acts, positions, and timing. The husband was obligated to ensure that his wife's needs were met, but he was also bound to complete the act in a manner that preserved the possibility of conception, even when conception was not the primary intent. The tension between these two obligations, pleasuring one's wife and preserving one's seed, generated centuries of nuanced rabbinic discussion. Some authorities were relatively permissive, allowing considerable freedom within the marital relationship as long as the act ultimately concluded in a manner consistent with the possibility of conception. Others were far more restrictive, interpreting the prohibition broadly and placing tight limitations on the forms of intimacy that were acceptable. What emerged from this centuries-long conversation was a distinctive understanding of sexuality that differed markedly from both the asceticism of Christianity and the permissiveness of pagan cultures. The Hebrew tradition and its rabbinic continuation affirmed that sexual pleasure within marriage was not merely permitted, but commanded. But it insisted that this pleasure was always embedded in a web of obligations to one's spouse, to one's lineage, to the community, and to God. But Onan's story was not the only tale of sexual scandal in the Hebrew Bible, not by a long stretch. The next chapter of our journey takes us to the women who lived outside the boundaries of respectable society, and whose stories reveal just how complicated the Hebrew relationship with desire really was. The Hebrew Bible has a complicated relationship with prostitution. On one hand, it is clearly stigmatized. On the other hand, Some of the most celebrated figures in biblical history are connected to it in ways that the authors seem remarkably untroubled by. Two Hebrew words are central to this discussion: Zonah, which refers to a common prostitute, a woman who sells sexual services, and Kadesha, a term often translated as cult prostitute or consecrated woman, associated with the fertility temples of Canaan. The distinction between these two categories is not always clear in the text, and scholars continue to debate whether the Kadesha was truly a religious functionary, a sacred servant of Astarte or Asherah, or simply a prostitute given a more elevated title by cultural convention. Deuteronomy 23 is explicit in its prohibition. No Israelite woman shall be a Kadesha. No Israelite man shall be a Kadesh, the male equivalent. The earnings of a Zonah or a Kadesh, which the text memorably calls the price of a dog, shall not be brought into the house of the Lord. The message is clear. Cult prostitution is utterly forbidden, and the money generated by commercial sex is unfit for sacred purposes. And yet, the Bible's most famous prostitute is also one of its greatest heroes. Rahab lived in the Canaanite city of Jericho. The text identifies her simply as a Zonah. When Joshua sent spies into the city before the Israelite conquest, Rahab sheltered them, lied to the authorities to protect them, and helped them escape. In return, she and her entire family were spared when Jericho fell. She was absorbed into the Israelite community, and, according to rabbinic tradition and the genealogy recorded in the Gospel of Matthew, she became an ancestor of King David himself, and ultimately of the line from which the Messiah would descend, a prostitute, an ancestor of kings and prophets. The Bible does not flinch from this. And then there is the story of Judah and Tamar, which we touched on earlier, but which deserves a fuller telling. After the deaths of and Onan, Judah promises Tamar that she can marry his third son, Shelah, when the boy comes of age. But the years pass, and Judah does not keep his promise. Tamar, left in limbo, takes matters into her own hands. She learns that Judah is traveling to Timnah for the sheep shearing season. She removes her widow's garments, veils herself, and sits by the roadside. Judah, not recognizing his daughter-in-law, takes her for a prostitute and propositions her. She negotiates payment, his seal, his cord, and his staff as a pledge, until he sends the promised young goat. They are intimate, and Tamar conceives. When Judah later sends a friend to deliver the goat and retrieve his belongings, the friend asks around the area for the Kadesha, who was sitting by the road. No one knows of any such woman. Months later, when Tamar's pregnancy becomes visible, Judah is outraged and orders her burned. It is only when she produces his seal, cord, and staff, proving he is the father, that Judah relents. She is more righteous than I, he admits, because I did not give her to my son, Shelah. The audacity of this story is remarkable. Tamar uses deception and sexual strategy to ensure the continuation of her deceased husband's lineage, and the text vindicates her. She is not punished, she is praised. Her twin sons, Perez and Zerah, become founders of significant Israelite clans. What these stories reveal is a society that, despite its strict public codes, understood the messiness of human desire and the impossibility of containing it within neat legal categories. Prostitution existed. Everyone knew it existed. The law regulated it, condemned the cultic version, and stigmatized the commercial form. But individual stories of women who operated outside the boundaries, women like Rahab and Tamar, were woven into the most sacred narratives of the nation. The double standard, however, remains unmistakable. Judah suffers no consequences for seeking a prostitute. Tamar would have been burned alive for the same act had she not been able to prove the identity of the father. The law's weight fell unevenly, and it fell heaviest on women. There is a third biblical story involving prostitution that deserves mention, because it reveals yet another dimension of the Hebrew attitude. The book of Joshua records that when the Israelites were preparing to cross the Jordan and conquer the Promised Land, Joshua sent 2 spies into the fortified city of Jericho. They went to the house of Rahab, a Zonah, and lodged there. Why would Israelite spies go to a prostitute's house? The practical answer is simple. A brothel was the one place in an ancient city where the arrival of strangers would not attract attention. Men came and went at all hours. No one asked questions. But the theological implications go deeper. Rahab, a Canaanite woman practicing the oldest profession, demonstrates greater faith in the God of Israel than most of the Israelites themselves. She tells the spies that she knows their God has given them the land, that everyone in Jericho is terrified, and she asks only that her family be spared in the coming destruction. The spies agree. When Jericho falls, Rahab and her household are saved. She is absorbed into the Israelite community, and according to rabbinic tradition, she married Joshua himself, though other traditions link her to different prominent figures. The genealogy in Matthew's Gospel places her in the direct lineage of David and of Jesus. The story of Rahab challenges any simple reading of Hebrew attitudes toward prostitution. She's not condemned, pitied, or moralized about. She is celebrated for her courage, her faith, and her strategic intelligence. The Hebrew Bible allows her a dignity that the social stigma of her profession might otherwise have denied her. This complexity extends to the broader question of how common prostitution actually was in ancient Israelite society. The prophets frequently rail against it, which suggests it was prevalent enough to warrant repeated condemnation. Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel all use prostitution as a metaphor for Israel's spiritual infidelity. And the force of the metaphor depends on the audience's familiarity with the literal practice. The book of Proverbs contains multiple warnings against the seductive woman, the adulteress, whose lips drip honey but whose path leads to death. Yet, the law itself takes a notably restrained approach. Ordinary prostitution, as opposed to cultic prostitution, is not explicitly punished in the Torah. A priest is forbidden from marrying a Zonah, and a father is told not to make his daughter a prostitute. But there is no statute prescribing a penalty for the act itself. The social stigma was real and powerful, but the legal framework left a space of ambiguity that the prophets and the rabbis would spend centuries trying to fill. That imbalance becomes even more striking when we examine the most serious sexual offense in Hebrew law and the extraordinary ritual that was created to address it. In the ancient Hebrew legal system, adultery was not a personal failing or a private shame. It was a capital crime. The punishment prescribed by the Torah was death for both parties involved. Leviticus 20, verse 10. If a man commits adultery with another man's wife, both the adulterer and the adulteress must be put to death. Deuteronomy 22 specifies the method as stoning, but the definition of adultery itself reveals the gendered nature of the law. Adultery, in the Hebrew Bible, was defined specifically as sexual intercourse between a married or betrothed woman and a man who was not her husband. If a married man had relations with an unmarried woman, it was not adultery. It was a different category of offense. or in some cases, no offense at all. The reason, once again, comes down to lineage. The concern was not with a man's fidelity in the abstract, but with the certainty of paternity. A married woman who slept with another man might become pregnant. The resulting child could inherit property and status under false pretenses, contaminating the family line and violating the covenantal relationship between God and the tribe. A married man who slept with an unmarried woman created no such uncertainty about his wife's children. His infidelity was certainly frowned upon. The Talmud records rabbis expressing disgust at male adultery, but it did not carry the same existential threat to the social order. The practical question, of course, is how often was the death penalty actually carried out? The evidence suggests rarely, if ever. The evidentiary requirements for capital punishment in Jewish law were so stringent that conviction was nearly impossible. 2 eyewitnesses who had warned the accused beforehand. A court of 23 judges. Extensive procedural safeguards. The Talmud records that a court that executed one person in 70 years was considered destructive. But there was one situation that fell between foolproof and complete ignorance. The case of suspicion. And for that, the ancient Hebrews developed one of the most unusual legal rituals in the history of civilization. The Sotah, the suspected adulteress. Numbers chapter 5 describes the procedure in detail. If a husband suspects his wife of infidelity, but has no proof, no witnesses, no confession, he can bring her before the priest at the tabernacle. The priest prepares a potion made of holy water, dust from the tabernacle floor, and the dissolved ink of written curses scraped from a scroll. The woman's hair is unbound, a sign of humiliation. She is made to hold a grain offering of barley meal, a cheaper flour normally reserved for animal feed. The priest administers an oath. If you have been unfaithful, may this water enter your body and cause your abdomen to swell and your thigh to waste away. If you are innocent, you shall be unharmed and shall conceive children. The woman drinks. According to the text, if she was guilty, the potion would cause visible, horrifying symptoms. If innocent, she would suffer nothing and would be blessed with fertility. Modern scholars have approached this ritual from every angle. Was the potion genuinely toxic? The ingredients, water, dust, and ink, contain nothing that could reliably distinguish guilt from innocence. Many scholars believe the ritual relied on the psychosomatic power of suggestion. A guilty woman, convinced of divine punishment, might exhibit physical symptoms of extreme stress. An innocent woman, confident in her purity, might remain calm. Others have proposed that the ritual served a more subtle social function. By transferring the judgment from the husband to God, the Sotah procedure actually protected women from vigilante violence. In surrounding cultures, a suspected adulteress could be beaten, killed, or cast out by her husband with no recourse. The Hebrew system required a formal procedure, a priestly intermediary, and divine adjudication. It was, in its strange way, a constraint on male rage. The Mishnah adds important details that the biblical text omits. The husband could only initiate the Sotah process if he had first warned his wife, in front of 2 witnesses, not to be alone with a specific man. 2 witnesses then had to testify that she had subsequently been seen secluding herself with that man. Without these preconditions, the ritual could not proceed, and at any point, the woman could refuse to drink, though this meant forfeiting her ketubah and accepting divorce. Perhaps most remarkably, The Talmud records that the bitter waters only worked if the husband himself was free from sexual sin. If he had ever been unfaithful, the potion had no effect. This provision effectively rendered the ritual unusable in an era of widespread moral compromise, which is precisely why the Sanhedrin abolished it sometime in the 1st century CE. Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai is credited with ending the practice, reportedly declaring that since adulterers had become so numerous, the bitter waters could no longer function as intended. The divine mechanism, it seemed, required a standard of purity that neither party could meet. The abolition of the Sotah ritual raises a fascinating theological question. If the ritual depended on God's direct intervention, what did it mean when the rabbis declared it no longer effective? Were they acknowledging that human sinfulness had overwhelmed the divine mechanism? Or were they finding a graceful way to retire a practice that had become increasingly problematic in a more sophisticated legal environment? The answer probably lies somewhere in between. The Sotah ritual belonged to a world where divine signs and supernatural interventions were expected elements of justice. As Jewish law matured and developed more rigorous evidentiary standards, the idea of resolving a legal dispute through a potion and a prayer became increasingly difficult to sustain. The rabbis preserved the ritual in their legal discussions, but effectively removed it from practice, allowing it to exist as a theoretical framework rather than a living institution. But the Sotah's legacy extends beyond its own abolition. The principle that lay behind it, that sexual fidelity was so important that it warranted divine intervention to determine the truth, continued to shape Jewish thinking about marriage for centuries. The intensity of the ritual's humiliations, the public exposure, the unbound hair, the torn garments, the coarse grain offering, all communicated a message about the gravity of adultery that no mere legal penalty could convey. The Sotah was not just a trial. It was a spectacle designed to impress upon every witness the terrifying consequences of marital betrayal. The Talmud explicitly draws this connection. It states that the punishments of the Sotah were designed to reflect the principle of measure for measure. She adorned herself for the adulterer, therefore the priest strips away her adornment. She braided her hair for him, therefore the priest unbinds it. She displayed her body for him, therefore her body is exposed. The symmetry is deliberate and merciless. And there is one more detail that has fascinated scholars for centuries. The ritual required the priest to erase the divine name, written on a scroll, into the bitter water. In a tradition that treats the name of God with the utmost reverence, that forbids its erasure under almost all circumstances, this is an extraordinary exception. The rabbis interpreted it as proof of how deeply God valued marital peace. The creator of the universe was willing to have his own name dissolved in water if it would preserve a marriage and reveal the truth. That willingness to sacrifice the sacred for the sake of domestic harmony tells us something profound about Hebrew priorities. The marriage bond was not merely a social contract or an economic arrangement. It was a reflection of the covenant between God and Israel, and its preservation justified extraordinary measures. But the stories that reveal the deepest truths about Hebrew sexual ethics are not found in legal codes at all. They are found in the narratives, the raw, unflinching stories of violation, power, and silence that the Bible records with uncomfortable honesty. The Hebrew Bible contains stories that most religious education quietly skips over. Stories of sexual violence, exploitation, and betrayal that stand in stark, uncomfortable contrast to the idealized laws of the Torah. These narratives are not accidents. They are deliberately preserved, and they reveal the distance between what the law commanded and what actually happened in the lives of the people who lived under it. The story of Dinah is one of the earliest and most disturbing. Genesis chapter 34 tells us that Dinah, the daughter of Jacob and Leah, went out to visit the women of the region. Shechem, the son of the local Canaanite ruler, saw her, took her, and violated her. But then, the text says, his soul was drawn to her. He loved her. He spoke tenderly to her. He asked his father to arrange a marriage. The contrast is jarring. In one verse, an act of brutal violation. In the next, romantic language. Modern readers struggle with this juxtaposition, but it reveals something important about the ancient world's understanding of sexual violence. The line between consent and coercion was drawn very differently, and marriage was often seen as a legitimate resolution for assault. Dinah's brothers, Simeon and Levi, had a different view. They agreed to the marriage on one condition: every man in Shechem city must be circumcised. While the men were still recovering from the procedure, Simeon and Levi attacked the city, killed every male, and took the women and children as captives. When Jacob rebuked them for the violence, they replied with a question that still resonates: should our sister be treated like a prostitute? The text gives no voice to Dinah herself. We never hear what she wanted, what she felt, or what became of her afterward. She is the center of the story and yet entirely silent within it. The concubine of Gibeah, described in Judges chapter 19, is perhaps the most harrowing narrative in the entire Hebrew Bible. A Levite man and his concubine are traveling through the territory of Benjamin. They take shelter in the town of Gibeah, hosted by an old man. During the night, the men of the town surround the house, demanding that the host send out his male guest so they can assault him. The host refuses and instead offers his own virgin daughter and the Levite's concubine. The Levite pushes his concubine outside. The men of the town abuse her throughout the night. At dawn, she collapses at the threshold of the house. The Levite finds her in the morning, tells her to get up, and when she does not respond, he loads her onto his donkey and takes her home. There, he cuts her body into 12 pieces and sends one to each tribe of Israel as a call to war. The resulting conflict nearly destroys the tribe of Benjamin. But the horror of the story is not only in the violence itself. It is in the utter disposability of the woman. She has no name. She has no voice. She is an instrument in a political narrative, and her suffering is the catalyst for tribal warfare rather than an occasion for mourning or justice. Then there is David and Bathsheba. The king of Israel, walking on his rooftop, sees a beautiful woman bathing. He sends for her. She comes. They are together. She becomes pregnant. David arranges for her husband Uriah, a loyal soldier, to be placed in the front lines of battle, where he will certainly be killed. Uriah dies. David marries Bathsheba. The traditional reading presents David as a sinner who repents. But modern scholars have raised uncomfortable questions about consent. Can a woman summoned by the most powerful man in the kingdom truly refuse? The power differential between a king and a subject's wife makes the notion of free consent deeply problematic. And finally, there is the story of Amnon and Tamar, perhaps the most psychologically devastating narrative in the Hebrew Bible. Amnon, David's eldest son, becomes obsessed with his half-sister Tamar. He feigns illness and asks David to send Tamar to care for him. When she comes to his room with food she has prepared, He grabs her and demands she lie with him. Tamar pleads with him. "No, my brother," she says, "do not force me. Such a thing is not done in Israel. Do not do this disgraceful thing. If you want me, speak to the king. He will not refuse you." Her plea is rational, eloquent, and desperate. Amnon ignores it. He overpowers her. And then, the text says, the hatred with which he hated her was greater than the love with which he had loved her. He tells her to leave. When she refuses, he has a servant throw her out and bolt the door behind her. Tamar tears her robe, puts ashes on her head, and weeps. When David hears what has happened, he is angry but does nothing. Tamar's brother Absalom tells her to be quiet and not take the matter to heart. She lives in Absalom's house, the text tells us, a desolate woman. Years later, Absalom avenges his sister by having Amnon killed, setting off a chain of events that leads to civil war and Absalom's own death. These stories are preserved in the sacred text not as endorsements, but as witnesses. They testify to the gap between law and reality, between the ideal of holiness and the brokenness of human behavior. They remind us that the people who wrote these laws were not living in a paradise of perfect compliance. They were struggling, failing, and trying to build something better in a world that often resisted their efforts. There is a pattern in these narratives that reveals something crucial about the Hebrew moral imagination. In each case, the consequences of sexual violation extend far beyond the individuals involved. Dinah's assault leads to the destruction of an entire city and the rebuke of 2 of Jacob's sons. The abuse of the concubine at Gibeah triggers a civil war that nearly annihilates a tribe. David's liaison with Bathsheba sets off a chain of events, including the death of their first child, the assault on Tamar by Amnon, Absalom's rebellion, and ultimately the fracturing of the kingdom that dominates the rest of his reign. The message embedded in these stories is unmistakable. Sexual transgression is never private. It always ripples outward. It destabilizes families, communities, and nations. This understanding is what gives the Torah's sexual regulations their urgency. The lawgivers were not concerned with policing individual pleasure for its own sake. They were trying to prevent the cascade of social destruction that they believed inevitably followed when the boundaries of intimacy were breached. This may be the single most important insight for understanding the Hebrew approach to sexuality. It was never about shame for its own sake. It was about the recognition that in a tightly knit tribal society, where every family was connected to every other by bonds of kinship, obligation, and covenant, the sexual choices of individuals had communal consequences that could not be ignored. The prophet Ezekiel makes this point with devastating imagery when he compares Jerusalem itself to a woman who has played the harlot, who has given herself to foreign nations and foreign gods, and who will be punished not for private immorality, but for the betrayal of a covenant that was supposed to hold the entire community together. But the Hebrew concern with the body extended beyond sexual acts. It began with something even more primal, the simple fact of being unclothed. The story of human shame begins, according to the Hebrew Bible, in a garden. Adam and Eve, freshly created, are naked and unashamed. The text states this explicitly. They were both naked, the man and his wife, and they felt no shame. And then everything changes. They eat from the forbidden tree. Their eyes are opened, and the very first consequence of this new knowledge is not wisdom, not power, not understanding. It is embarrassment. They realize they are naked. They sew fig leaves together. They hide from God. This narrative is so familiar that we often miss how extraordinary it is. The very first effect of sin, in the Hebrew imagination, is bodily shame. The acquisition of moral knowledge does not begin with an insight into justice or mercy or truth. It begins with the sudden, unbearable awareness of the exposed human body. For the ancient Hebrews, this was not merely a story about the past. It was an explanation for the present. The human condition, in their understanding, was fundamentally marked by the tension between the body's naturalness and its capacity for disgrace. The Hebrew word irva, often translated as nakedness or exposure, became a central term in their legal and moral vocabulary. In Leviticus 18, the phrase "uncover the nakedness of" is the standard euphemism for sexual intercourse. To see someone's nakedness was to violate them at the deepest level. This theology of the body produced one of the Bible's most puzzling stories. After the great flood, Noah plants a vineyard, drinks the wine, becomes intoxicated, and falls asleep naked in his tent. His son Ham enters the tent and sees his father's nakedness. Instead of covering Noah, Ham goes outside and tells his two brothers. Shem and Japheth respond by walking backward into the tent with a garment, covering their father without looking at him. When Noah wakes and learns what has happened, he curses not Ham but Ham's son Canaan, condemning his descendants to servitude. The severity of this response has baffled readers for millennia. What exactly did Ham do? Simply seeing his father naked hardly seems worthy of a generational curse. Rabbinic tradition has proposed various explanations, some suggesting that Ham committed a far more serious act against his unconscious father than the plain text describes. Others have argued that the offense was not physical but moral, a violation of filial piety, a mockery of the father's dignity at his most vulnerable. Whatever the interpretation, the message is consistent. The exposed body is dangerous territory. To look upon it carelessly, to treat it with disrespect, to fail to guard its dignity, carries consequences that ripple across generations. This understanding shaped Hebrew daily life in ways that extended far beyond law. Clothing became a moral statement. The priests who served in the tabernacle, and later the temple, wore specific garments that covered their bodies completely. The text even specifies that the altar must not have steps, lest the priest's body be inadvertently exposed as he climbs. The architecture of worship was designed around the prevention of accidental nudity. For the Hebrews, the body was not evil. It was created by God and declared good. But it was also powerful, dangerous, and charged with sacred significance. To expose it was to release something that could not easily be contained, and to regulate it, to clothe it, to set boundaries around it, was one of the fundamental acts of civilization. There is a detail in the creation narrative that many readers pass over, but which carries enormous theological weight. After Adam and Eve realize their nakedness and sew fig leaf garments for themselves, God does something unexpected. He makes them garments of skin and clothes them. The creator of the universe becomes, in this moment, a tailor. The act of covering the human body is not left to human improvisation alone. God participates in it. The implication is that clothing is not merely a cultural invention, but a divine provision, a response to the new reality of the fallen world. This understanding influenced everything from the design of the priestly vestments, which were described in extraordinary detail in Exodus, to the everyday dress codes that governed Israelite society. The Torah prohibits cross-dressing, forbidding a man to wear women's clothing and a woman to wear men's. The reason given is that such acts are toevah, the same word used for the sexual prohibitions in Leviticus 18. The connection between clothing and sexual identity was absolute. Some scholars have argued that this prohibition against cross-dressing was directly linked to the cultic practices of surrounding cultures, where priests of certain deities, particularly the male priests of Ishtar, were known to dress in women's garments as part of their ritual role. Once again, the Hebrew code drew a sharp line between its own practice and the practices of its neighbors. Even the way you dressed was a declaration of identity. The Song of Solomon, that remarkable poem of erotic love that somehow found its way into the biblical canon, approaches the body with a very different tone. It celebrates the human form in language that is at times strikingly explicit. Your navel is a rounded goblet that never lacks blended wine. Your waist is a mound of wheat surrounded by lilies. Your two breasts are like two fawns, twins of a gazelle. The beloved's body is described as a garden, an orchard, a fountain sealed. The inclusion of this text in sacred scripture has puzzled and delighted readers for millennia. How does a love poem, seemingly devoid of overt theological content, belong in the same collection as the prohibitions of Leviticus? The traditional answer, both Jewish and Christian, has been to read the song as an allegory, a metaphor for the love between God and Israel, or between Christ and the Church. But many modern scholars insist that the plain meaning of the text is exactly what it appears to be, a celebration of human erotic love in all its beauty and intensity. If both readings are valid, then the Hebrew Bible presents us with a remarkable paradox. The same tradition that policed the boundaries of the body with fierce precision also produced one of the most beautiful celebrations of physical love in all of literature. Shame and celebration, prohibition and exaltation exist side by side in the same canon. Perhaps that paradox is not a contradiction at all, but a reflection of the genuine complexity of the human relationship with the body. This understanding of the body, born in a garden, codified in law, and enforced through ritual, would outlast the Hebrew nation itself. It would pass into Christianity, into Islam, into the secular legal traditions of the West, and its influence continues to shape how billions of people think about nakedness, desire, and shame to this very day. Let us step back for a moment and take in the full scope of what we have been exploring. A small, semi-nomadic tribe in the ancient Near East, never numbering more than a few million at its height, surrounded by vast empires with radically different sexual norms. It developed a code of intimate behavior, so detailed and so powerful that it reshaped the moral architecture of the entire Western world, and much of the Eastern world as well. How did this happen? The answer begins with a single historical accident. When Christianity emerged from within Judaism in the 1st century CE, it inherited the Hebrew moral framework wholesale. Paul of Tarsus, himself a trained Pharisee, carried the sexual ethics of the Torah into the Gentile world. The prohibition against adultery, the condemnation of cult prostitution, the regulation of desire within marriage, the equation of sexual sin with spiritual danger, all of these pass directly from the Hebrew tradition into the new faith. But Christianity also intensified certain elements. Where the Hebrew tradition celebrated marital intimacy as a positive good, a mitzvah, a commandment to be fulfilled with joy, early Christian theology increasingly associated sex with sin. Augustine of Hippo, writing in the 4th and 5th centuries, developed the doctrine of original sin in a way that permanently linked human sexuality to the fall of Adam and Eve. The shame in the garden became the template for all Christian thinking about the body. The celibacy of priests, the suspicion of pleasure, the elevation of virginity as a spiritual ideal, none of these have clear roots in Hebrew law. They emerged from the collision between Jewish sexual ethics and Greek philosophical traditions, particularly Stoicism and Neoplatonism, which viewed the body as inferior to the soul and physical pleasure as a distraction from higher truth. Islam, arriving in the 7th century, took a different path. Muhammad drew heavily on the Hebrew patriarchal model. Polygamy was permitted, as in Hebrew law, though limited to 4 wives rather than being theoretically unlimited. The regulation of female modesty echoed the Hebrew concern with erva. The emphasis on lineage and paternity mirrored the Hebrew obsession with genealogical purity. But Islam also retained more of the Hebrew positive attitude toward marital intimacy, viewing it as a legitimate blessing rather than a necessary evil. The medieval period saw these traditions harden into institutions. The Catholic Church codified its sexual teaching with ever greater specificity. The story of Onan became the theological foundation for opposing all forms of contraception. The Levitical prohibitions against same-sex acts were enshrined in criminal law across Europe. The concept of adultery as a capital offense, while rarely enforced with execution, remained a basis for divorce, property disputes, and social ostracism for centuries. The Protestant Reformation of the 16th century modified some of these traditions. Luther rejected clerical celibacy and affirmed the goodness of marital sex with greater enthusiasm than his Catholic predecessors. Calvin maintained a strict sexual morality, but emphasized the covenant nature of marriage over its sacramental character. Yet both reformers operated entirely within the moral universe that the early Hebrews had constructed. It was not until the Enlightenment of the 18th century that Western thinkers began to seriously question the Hebrew sexual framework. Philosophers like Voltaire and Hume challenged the authority of biblical morality. The rise of individual rights philosophy gradually shifted the moral center from divine command to personal consent. The sexual revolutions of the 20th century, first in the 1920s and then more dramatically in the 1960s, represented the most sustained challenge to the Hebrew moral legacy in over 2,000 years. And yet, here we are. In the 21st century, and the debates still rage along lines that would be recognizable to the authors of Leviticus: the boundaries of marriage, the morality of same-sex relationships, the regulation of reproductive choices, the tension between personal freedom and communal standards. These are not new conversations. They are very, very old conversations, dressed in new language. Consider some specific examples that most people never trace back to their ancient Hebrew origins. The age of consent laws that exist in virtually every modern legal system descend in part from the rabbinic discussions about when a girl was old enough to be betrothed and when a marriage could be consummated. The concept of marital privacy, the idea that what happens between husband and wife in the bedroom is not the business of the state, has roots in the Hebrew emphasis on the sanctity of the marriage chamber as a space apart from the community. Even the language we use carries Hebrew fingerprints. The word sodomy, derived from the story of Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis, was the standard legal term for certain prohibited acts in English common law for centuries. The concept of fornication, meaning sex outside of marriage, derives its moral weight primarily from the Pauline epistles, which themselves draw directly on the Torah's sexual regulations. The institution of marriage itself, as understood in the West, is a Hebrew construction far more than a Greek or Roman one. The Greeks celebrated pederasty alongside marriage. The Romans treated sex with slaves and prostitutes as morally neutral. It was the Hebrew insistence on marriage as a covenantal bond, with specific rights and obligations for both parties, that provided the template for the Western marital ideal. In the 21st century, we are witnessing what may be the most significant reassessment of the Hebrew sexual legacy since the Enlightenment. Movements for gender equality, reproductive rights, and the acceptance of diverse sexual orientations are challenging assumptions that have been into place for millennia. The conversations are heated, passionate, and often bitter, precisely because what is at stake is not merely a set of rules, but an entire way of understanding what it means to be human, embodied, and connected to others through the most intimate acts of which we are capable. Some see the dismantling of these ancient codes as liberation. Others see it as the unraveling of the moral fabric that holds civilization together. What is certain is that neither side can fully understand their own position without understanding where these ideas came from. And where they came from is a landscape of desert tents, tribal councils, priestly rituals, and a small people's audacious claim that the God who made the universe cared deeply about what happened in the marriage bed. The sexual taboos of the early Hebrews did not merely reflect the anxieties of one particular time and place. They tapped into something universal, something about the way human beings experience desire, shame, connection, and fear. That is why they endured. Not because they were imposed by force, though sometimes they were, but because they addressed questions that every human society must answer. What is the body for? What are the limits of desire? Who belongs to whom? And what happens when those limits are transgressed? The ancient Hebrews offered their answers. Billions of people still live with them. And so we arrive at the end of this journey. But I hope, in some way, it does not feel like an ending at all. We have traveled from the fertility temples of Mesopotamia to the marriage contracts of ancient Israel, from the blood-stained cloths of wedding nights to the bitter waters of the Sotah ritual, from the tragic silence of Dinah to the cunning courage of Tamar, from the precise regulations of the Niddah to the cosmic consequences of Onan's refusal. What strikes me most, after spending all this time in these ancient texts, is not how alien these people were. It is how familiar they remain. They struggled with the same tensions we struggle with. The desire for intimacy and the fear of vulnerability, the need for control and the impossibility of achieving it, the longing for purity in a world that stubbornly refuses to be pure. There is something deeply moving about the fact that a tribe of desert nomads, surrounded by empires that celebrated sexual excess as a form of worship, chose a different path. They did not deny the power of desire. They acknowledged it, feared it, and tried to channel it. They understood that the forces at work in the bedroom were the same forces that could build or destroy a family, a tribe, a nation, and they crafted their laws accordingly. Were those laws perfect? Of course not. The double standards are undeniable. The weight that fell on women, the testing of virginity, the humiliations of the Sotah, the silencing of voices like Dinah's, all of these are painful to confront. No honest examination of the Hebrew sexual code can avoid acknowledging that the system, for all its moments of surprising progressivism, was built within and for a patriarchal society. But honesty also requires us to acknowledge what was remarkable about this system. The concept of Onah, a wife's legal right to sexual fulfillment, was centuries ahead of its time. The Levirate marriage, for all its strangeness to modern ears, was designed to protect the most vulnerable members of society, childless widows who would otherwise face destitution. The Niddah laws, whatever we think of their premise, created a rhythm of intimacy that many couples, even today, find genuinely enriching. And the Sotah ritual, for all its horror, actually constrained the violence of jealous husbands by redirecting judgment from human hands to divine authority. The early Hebrews did not solve these tensions. No culture has. But they did something remarkable. They took the most private, most vulnerable, most powerful dimension of human experience, and they placed it at the center of their relationship with the divine. Sex was not peripheral to their faith. It was woven into the fabric of it. Every act of intimacy was freighted with meaning. Every transgression carried cosmic weight. You consider the audacity of this vision for a moment. In a world where the great empires treated sexual behavior as a matter of personal preference or political convenience, where pharaohs married their sisters and Babylonian kings copulated with priestesses as a matter of state policy, the Hebrews declared that the Creator of the universe had opinions about what happened between a husband and wife on an ordinary Tuesday night. That claim changed the course of history. It also created a legacy that we are still grappling with, still arguing about, still trying to understand. The conversations happening right now, in legislatures and courtrooms, in pulpits and classrooms, in living rooms and bedrooms around the world, about the definition of marriage, about reproductive rights, about consent, about the relationship between religion and the body. These conversations are the direct descendants of the debates that the early Hebrews initiated 3,000 years ago. You may admire that vision or recoil from it. You may see wisdom in their regulations or oppression in their double standards. But you cannot deny their influence. The decisions made around those desert campfires thousands of years ago are still shaping the world you live in today. Think about that the next time someone tells you that the past is dead. I want to leave you with one final thought. The Hebrew word for holy is kadosh. It means set apart, separated, distinct. The entire sexual code of the early Hebrews was built on this concept. To be holy was to be different, to draw lines that others would not draw, to say no to practices that everyone around you accepted as normal. In our own time, when the boundaries of the acceptable shift so rapidly that yesterday's transgression becomes today's convention, there is something worth reflecting on in the Hebrew approach. Not necessarily in the specific content of their rules, which belonged to a particular time, place, and cultural context, but in the underlying conviction that boundaries matter, that how we relate to one another's bodies is not a trivial question, that the most intimate dimensions of human life deserve careful thought, not careless indifference. The early Hebrews were not the last word on sexual ethics. Whether we agree with their conclusions or not, is to engage with these questions with the same seriousness, the same honesty, and the same willingness to grapple with complexity that they brought to them 3,000 years ago. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it challenged something you believed or confirmed something you suspected, leave a comment. Share this with someone who loves history, who questions tradition, who is not afraid to look at the uncomfortable truths beneath the surface of the familiar. And if you have not already, subscribe. There are many more stories to tell, stories hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone willing to sit by the fire and listen. Until next time, be well, be curious, and never stop asking questions.